thought, very personal in terms of my own interest, but people may know I've done a lot of work myself on the origins of Zionism and Zionism's claim on Jewish history way back even 2,000 years ago. Chris's chapter on Christianity is a model. It's an absolute model. Again, I'm just touching the surface, but the way in which Judaism, the Jewish religion, expanded very rapidly, roughly 2,000 years ago under the Roman Empire, and became momentarily almost an ideology for the masses, but was restricted, and kind of Christianity grew out of that. I'm obviously being fantastically simplistic, but essentially this is what Chris is writing about. I've subsequently both been at lectures and read about this, and there's no question that Chris's chapter, brief though it is, captures the heart of the argument as it's understood by the most sophisticated experts who now, the ancient historians, who pore over this period, because it's obviously incredibly important. So I'm recommending the book anyway. That's a particular brilliant chapter. Again, just going forward into the beginnings of capitalism. Chris's chapter on Spain, Christopher Columbus and all that, Spain's discovery of America, so-called. How could you discover America? It was always there. But that whole period in our European history, Chris identifies what was a horrendous, disgusting, very bloody royalist regime, the United Spain, which had its Spanish Inquisition both against its Jewish and Muslim populations. It welded together a Christian nation, but it was extremely dynamic. Chris understood something about that dynamism, however oppressive royalist Spain was in its inception, because the market was beginning to grow. It was simultaneously quite dynamic. Kind of crude Marx systems, simple Marx systems. It was simultaneously feudal, but also embryonically capitalist, because it allowed the market to develop. Now this might seem terribly academic. There's a sharp argument with other Marxists, in particular the editor at the time of New Left Review, Perry Anderson, insisted this was not the case, that Spain was simply a feudal society. But in terms of the argument, when you date the origins of capitalism, is incredibly important. And in my judgment, Chris wins the argument that you date the origins of capitalism very early on, roughly about the time I'm saying, roughly about the 14th, 13th centuries, roughly about the time when so-called Christopher Columbus discovers America. So I think that's a really fascinating section. But there's something else a little bit later. I'm not going to do many quotes, but I just want to do one. Chris also writes about the Renaissance and the great Renaissance artists, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and he just writes this, something that I never knew. I'm just going to quote this, I think it's completely fascinating. One thing that Chris constantly tries to do is a people's history. So he's interested to relate the history of the kings and the queens and the so-called great intellectuals to how ordinary people, how they relate to ordinary people. This is talking about Michelangelo. This is a quote from Chris's book. Michelangelo's God giving life to Adam, or the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, are religious works which celebrate humanity. Amongst Michelangelo's greatest works is a series of giant statues of slaves or prisoners, which men are struggling to free themselves from the stone in which they were trapped. I think that's incredibly important, because a Renaissance, when you hear the word, you don't necessarily relate it to revolution or the oppressed, but Chris, not crudely, with a great deal of care and sensitivity, is able to do that. And again, a very important section that I'm recommending. I've just noticed, how are we doing on time? Because I just noticed I was doing this as a headline. I missed one very important point I wanted to make, not to do with these two books. A pamphlet he wrote, which is also an article in International Socialism Journal, called The Prophet and the Proletariat. I'm just going to do this in terms of headlines. After the Iranian Revolution, both during and after the Iranian Revolution, the left everywhere, and half of it still is, in fact 3/4 of it still is, was completely bemused and shocked and actually hostile to the idea what might have been a socialist revolution became a so-called Islamic revolution. And everyone in the room will know, mullahs since then, Islamic political leaders since then, have had a relentless campaign of Islamophobia, racism thrown at them from all corners of the world, including lots of corners of the left. Chris's pamphlet and article, beautiful title, Prophet and the Proletariat, takes that on and says, of course they weren't socialists, and the reason why the workers, which were very strong in Iran, a bit like in Poland, weren't strong enough to actually take power because they didn't have the politics to take the power. The mosques filled in a vacuum, the workers' movement left. And the mosques had a left and a right inside the mosques. And this was a mass movement with a mass leadership. And in a way, the Islamic leaders played the same kind of role that earlier anti-imperialist leaders played in the struggles against colonialism in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. In other words, slightly crudely, but it's the same argument. The way in which Nasser, and indeed Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam and Nasser in Egypt, became anti-imperialist leaders, whilst at the same time developing forms of state capitalism in their own society, Chris argues the Islamic authorities, revolutionary authorities that took over, in a sense, the revolution in Iran in the 1980s, played the same kind of role. They were anti-imperialist, they did introduce serious reforms and reduce levels of inequality, but effectively they what Tony Cliff developed